In the summer of 1988, the United States Department of Agriculture reported that over 200,000 family farms had ceased operations in the previous decade alone. The land had not disappeared. The soil had not moved. But the people had. They left in trucks loaded with furniture and memory, down roads their grandfathers had graded by hand, past fields their grandmothers had walked barefoot in the early morning dew. They left because the banks came first, and the rain came last, and sometimes the rain did not come at all. Harlan County, Kentucky sat in a valley that the old maps called generous. The ridgelines held the cold longer than the flatlands, and the creeks ran brown in spring from the iron in the hillside clay. It was not the easiest place to farm. It never had been. But the Cutler family had been farming that particular stretch of bottomland since 1902, when Elmer Cutler arrived from eastern Virginia with a mule, a pregnant wife, and a coffee tin full of seed corn he had dried himself on the back porch of his father's house before he left. That seed corn mattered. That detail would matter later. But in the spring of 1991, when the story that people in Harlan County still talk about quietly began, nobody was thinking about seed corn. They were thinking about Earl Cutler, Elmer's grandson, and the fact that two men from the USDA had driven up his dirt lane in a white government truck and posted a notice on his barn door that changed everything. Earl was 61 years old that spring. He was not a tall man, and he had never been one to fill a room with his voice. He had thick hands that moved slowly and deliberately, hands that had shelled beans and pulled fence posts and laid his wife Margaret's coffin into a hole in the ground behind the old Methodist church in the winter of 1987. He had the look of a man who had been weathered not just by the sun but by time itself, the way a fence post gets when it has stood in every kind of rain for 30 years and simply becomes part of the ground it stands in. His farm was 114 acres. 80 of those acres were tillable. The rest was creek bottom, woodline, and a hillside pasture so rocky that his neighbor Dale Pruitt had once said you could sharpen a knife on it. Earl had 12 head of cattle, a 73 John Deere 4020 that burned oil and started mean in cold weather, a planter that needed 2 new seed plates, and a debt to First Commonwealth Bank in Harlan that had been growing quietly for 4 years like a vine up a fence post. The debt was not entirely Earl's fault. The drought of 1988 had taken 60% of his corn. The following year a late frost in April had blackened his tobacco plants at the soil line just after transplant, and he had replanted twice with borrowed money. In 1990 the price of burley tobacco dropped 14% and his yield was thin from a dry August. He had made his interest payments. He had not made his principal. And the bank had been patient the way banks are patient when they are deciding something. When the 2 USDA men came in April of 1991, they were not unkind. That was what bothered Earl the most about it, he said later. They were polite. They had clipboards and coffee thermoses and they wore clean boots that had never seen a field. They told him that his operating loan application had been reviewed and denied. They told him that based on his debt-to-asset ratio and his 3-year yield history, he did not qualify for federal farm credit assistance. They told him he had 60 days to satisfy his existing obligations to First Commonwealth or the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. One of the men handed Earl a pamphlet. It was about transitioning out of agricultural production. It had a picture on the front of a smiling older couple standing in front of what appeared to be a suburban house. Earl looked at the pamphlet for a long moment. Then he set it on the hood of their truck and walked back to his barn without saying a word. His daughter, Lena, was 28 that year. She had come back to the farm after her mother died, taking a leave from her nursing job in Lexington that had stretched into a permanent return she had never officially decided on. She was standing at the kitchen window when the white truck came down the lane, and she was still standing there when it left. She watched her father walk back to the barn. She watched him go inside. She waited. After 20 minutes she crossed the yard and pushed open the barn door. Earl was sitting on an overturned bucket in the half-dark, his elbows on his knees, looking at nothing in particular. The smell of old hay and diesel fuel and cattle was thick in the air. A barn swallow moved somewhere in the rafters. "Daddy," she said. "They denied the loan," he said. He said it the way you say a thing you already knew was coming, flatly, like reading a price off a feed store sign. "What does that mean for the planting?" "Means I can't buy seed. Can't buy fuel on credit. Can't hire anybody. He paused. Means they think I'm done. Lena leaned against the doorframe. Outside, the April light was thin and pale gold on the fields. The ground had dried out enough in the last week that you could walk it without your boots pulling, which meant it was close to ready. The soil in those bottom fields had a dark, almost black quality in spring, a richness that belied the difficulty of everything else about that land. Earl had said once that the ground was the best thing he had, and he had said it in the way people say things that are completely true. "Are you?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "I am not." What happened in the weeks that followed was not dramatic in the way that people who tell the story sometimes make it sound. There were no speeches. There was no single moment of transformation. What there was instead was Earl Cutler going very quiet and very methodical in the way that certain men do when they have decided something and do not need to announce it. The first thing he did was go to his cellar. The cellar under the farmhouse was an old stone-walled room that Earl's father had built in 1941 and that smelled of earth and wood and the mineral cold of deep ground. There were shelves along 3 walls, and on those shelves were things that most people in 1991 would have considered outdated. There were mason jars of dried beans in a dozen varieties, their labels written in his mother's handwriting. There were bundles of dried herbs tied with kitchen string. And in a corner of the second shelf from the bottom, in a row of coffee tins that had been there so long they had left rust rings in the wood, were Earl's seed corn. He had been saving seed corn since his father showed him how. His father had learned from his father, who had learned from Elmer, who had carried the original seed from Virginia in 1902. What Earl kept in those tins was not a single variety but a collection of open-pollinated corn that the Cutler family had selected and refined over 4 generations, choosing the best ears each year, the ones with the deepest color and the tightest rows and the stalks that stood in a hard wind, drying them on wire screens in the loft and shelling them by hand in November and storing them in those same coffee tins with a handful of dried ash leaves to keep the weevils off. This was not a practice that the Agricultural Extension Office had encouraged. They had been pushing hybrid seed for 30 years, and the yields from hybrids were genuinely higher in good years. Earl used hybrids too, when he could buy them. But he had never stopped saving his open-pollinated corn because his father had told him, simply and once, that a man who could not grow his own seed was a tenant on his own land. Earl had thought about that sentence many times over the years. In the spring of 1991 he thought about it again. He had enough seed corn for 12 acres. He had saved bean seed and squash and a variety of white half-runner pole bean his mother had grown that was not available commercially anywhere that he knew of. He had, in a separate tin that he kept on the highest shelf, a small quantity of seed from a variety of tobacco his grandfather had grown before the introduction of the standard burley varieties, a broad-leafed, slow-curing type that the old people had called Cutler's Red because of the color it turned in the curing barn. Most people did not know Earl had any of this. He was not the kind of man who talked about what he had. The second thing Earl did was walk his fields. He did this every morning for 2 weeks, starting before the sun was fully up, moving slowly along the rows and the fence lines and the low places where water stood after rain. He was not walking aimlessly. He was reading the ground the way you read a face you have known a long time, looking for what had changed, what was holding, what needed attention. He got down on his knees in several places and dug with his hands, lifting soil and breaking it apart and smelling it and letting it fall. He found where the drainage had improved from the tile work he had done in 1985. He found where a stretch of ground along the east fence was still compacted from where his neighbor had run a truck through it during a boundary dispute 3 years ago. He found something else, too. Along the creek bank where the bottomland turned to a narrow strip of sandy alluvial soil, he found a 1/4 acre of ground that he had never cultivated because it flooded too readily. But something had changed. The creek had shifted its channel slightly in the big water year of 1989, and the flooding pattern had changed with it. The ground there was loose and dark and fine-grained, the kind of soil that gardeners spend years trying to manufacture. It had been deposited by the creek over decades and it was as naturally fertile as anything Earl had ever put his hands in. He stood there for a while looking at it. "Huh," he said, to no one. The third thing Earl did was call on his neighbors. This was harder for him than the cellar or the field walking, because Earl was a private man and going to neighbors with anything that resembled need went against something in his nature. But he was also a practical man, and he had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was clear. He could not plant 80 acres with the fuel he had and the tractor running the way it was running. He needed help. He did not ask for charity. He drove his truck to 6 farms over 3 days and he offered trade. He offered to share his open pollinated seed in exchange for help with fuel and fieldwork. He offered to work their ground in the fall when he was done with his own. He offered, to 2 farmers he knew were interested in such things, cuttings from an apple tree on his property that was a variety nobody had been able to identify but that produced a hard, late-keeping fruit that lasted in cold storage until February without treatment. Most of the neighbors he visited were curious but cautious. They had heard about the USDA visit. Word moved fast in a county where people still listened to their neighbors' conversations at the diner without embarrassment. They thought Earl was probably finished, and they did not want to attach themselves to a finished man. But 2 of them said yes. One was Cora Hatfield, a 73-year-old widow whose husband had died in 1983 and who had been renting her tillable acres to a larger operation out of Middlesbrough ever since. She still lived in the farmhouse and still kept a kitchen garden of extraordinary productivity, and she had known Earl's mother. She said yes immediately, before he had finished asking. She had 200 gallons of diesel in a tank behind her barn that had been sitting there since her husband died, and she said Earl could have it if he needed it. The other was a younger man, 34 years old, named Marcus Webb, who farmed 80 acres adjacent to Earl's south fence and who had come to farming late after a decade working in the mines. Marcus was not a skilled farmer yet. He was willing and strong and he worked hard, but he made the mistakes that people make when they are still learning to read land. He had been interested in Earl for years the way a person who wants to learn something is interested in someone who knows it. He said yes, and he showed up the next morning at 6 a.m. with a truck and his own labor and no further discussion required. What happened through May and June of 1991 was, from the outside, unremarkable. An old man and a younger man planted fields on a small farm in a Kentucky valley. A widow brought lunch in a covered dish at noon. The John Deere 4020 started mean every morning, but it started. The seed went in the ground. What was not unremarkable was the attention Earl paid to every acre. He had made decisions that spring that went against everything the extension publications recommended. He had planted his open pollinated corn at a lower population density than hybrid recommendations called for, spacing his rows wider and his seeds farther apart within the row, because he knew from 4 generations of observation that his variety did better with more room, that it put out a wider root system than commercial hybrids and would compete with itself if crowded. He had planted the creek bank strip with the white half-runner beans and a variety of winter squash his mother had grown, intercrop the way old farmers used to intercrop before monoculture became the only conversation anyone wanted to have. He had done something else that Marcus watched with open skepticism. He had taken a portion of his remaining seed corn and planted it not in the main fields but in a careful, isolated block at the far end of the property, away from any chance of cross-pollination, specifically to grow seed for the following year. He was not planting that block to sell or eat. He was planting it to continue. "That's 6 acres you won't get income from," Marcus said one afternoon, watching Earl set the seed spacing on the planter. "It's 6 acres I'll get the next 40 years from," Earl said. Marcus thought about that. He did not say anything else about it. The summer of 1991 in Harlan County was dry in July and then dry again in August, which is the 2 months that matter most for corn. It was not a disaster-level drought, not like 1988, but it was enough to trim yields across the county. The farmers who had planted high population density hybrids in tight rows began to show stress first. The leaves rolled during the day. The ears set short. Earl's fields rolled too, in the afternoons, when the heat came off the ridge and the humidity dropped. But they recovered overnight in a way that the neighboring fields did not. The wider spacing meant the root systems had gone deeper looking for moisture, and the open pollinated variety Earl grew was one his family had selected for drought years, had been selecting for, specifically and deliberately, since the great drought years of the 1930s when Elmer's son Roy had walked these same fields and pulled the seed from the stalks that kept standing while others fell. This is not magic. It is not romantic. It is simply what happens when someone pays attention to the same land for 4 generations and keeps records, even imperfect records scratched in pencil in composition notebooks, and makes selection decisions year after year with patience that the market does not reward and that most people do not have. Lena noticed it first. She was hanging washing on the line in late July when she looked out across the main field and saw that her father's corn was darker green than the corn in Marcus's field to the south and darker than what she could see of Dale Pruitt's field to the north. She mentioned it at supper. Earl nodded. "It's the roots," he said. "It's gone down after the water." "How do you know that?" "Because that's what it does. Because that's what I bred it to do." He said this without any particular pride, in the same tone he might have used to explain why a door was hanging crooked. The county extension agent, a man named Gary Forsyth who had been in the job for 6 years and who drove a clean pickup and wore a university ball cap and was genuinely trying to help people, came by the farm in early August. He had been coming by periodically since the spring, partly out of professional duty and partly, Lena suspected, out of something that resembled guilt, though she never said this to her father. Gary walked the fields with Earl on a Tuesday morning. He was quiet for most of it. He stopped at the main corn block and looked for a while without speaking. "Your population density is way below recommended," he said finally. "Yes," Earl said. "You know we're recommending 32,000 plants per acre for this ground." "I've got 22, Earl said. "Give or take." "You're leaving yield on the table." Earl looked at him steadily. "I'm leaving it standing in the field," he said. "That's the yield I'm interested in." Gary looked at the corn again. He crouched and looked at the soil near the base of several stalks, pressed the ground with 2 fingers, watched the color change. He was not a stupid man. He had a degree in agronomy. He understood soil moisture. He stood up and looked at Earl with something new in his expression. "Where did you get this variety?" he said. "My grandfather brought the original from Virginia in 1902, Earl said. "We've been selecting it since." Gary was quiet again for a moment. "You know there are university programs that are interested in this kind of germplasm," he said. "There's a seed library program through the state that—" "I know about it," Earl said. "I've been thinking on it." He had been. It was one of the long thoughts he carried through the summer, about what he had and what it was worth and who it belonged to. He had not decided yet. August passed. September came with cooler nights and the first feeling of harvest in the air, that particular quality of late summer light that changes the way fields look, turns the green edges toward gold, makes the distances seem longer and the mornings feel significant. Earl's corn dried down in the field while he made other preparations. He had been cutting and curing the Cutler's red tobacco in the old log barn since early August. The curing barn had been on the property since 1931 and it had a specific system of vent boards that his grandfather had cut in a particular pattern to control airflow that Earl had never seen described in any publication anywhere. The tobacco went in green and came out in 6 weeks the color of dark copper, with a smell that was unlike any burley Earl had ever handled commercially, deeper and sweeter and with something earthy underneath. He did not have a buyer lined up. That was the problem. The standard burley market had its channels and its buyers and its auction floors, and Earl had sold through those channels all his life. But he had not grown Cutler's red in a quantity anyone would notice since his father's time, and he had no commercial relationship around it. He had 400 pounds of it cured in the barn and no clear idea what to do with that specific 400 pounds. It was Cora Hatfield who solved that particular problem, in the way that she solved many problems, which was by knowing someone who nobody else knew. She had a nephew in Lexington, a man who ran a small retail operation that sold specialty food products, local honey and hand-milled grains and that kind of thing, and who had for 2 years been trying to source specialty tobacco for a small number of pipe tobacco manufacturers who were paying premium prices for unusual American-grown varieties. Cora had heard her nephew mention this over Christmas dinner, had filed it in the back of her mind the way she filed everything, and had thought of it in August when Earl told her about the Cutler's red. She made a phone call. Her nephew made 2 phone calls. A man came from Lexington in a Volvo station wagon in October and stood in Earl's curing barn and held a leaf of Cutler's red up to the light coming through the vent boards and was quiet for a long time. "How much do you have?" he said. 412 pounds, cured weight, Earl said. The man named a price. It was 3 times the auction floor price for standard burley. Earl looked at him. "You sure about that?" he said. "I'm sure," the man said. "And I'd want to talk about next year." What happened at the corn harvest in October is the part that people in the county remember most, because it was visible in a way that the rest of it was not. The corn came off in the first 2 weeks of October, when the grain moisture had dropped to where it needed to be. Earl and Marcus ran the 40-20 with the 2-row picker that Earl had rebuilt that spring, going through the field in long passes while Lena drove the grain wagon alongside. The yield was not exceptional by the numbers that hybrid seed companies put in their catalogs. It was not going to appear in any magazine as a demonstration of maximum productivity. But for an open-pollinated variety grown on a drought year with no purchased inputs and no irrigation and no credit, it was enough. More than enough. Marcus ran the numbers one evening sitting at Earl's kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. He added up the corn yield, the bean crop from the creek bank strip, the winter squash, the Cutler's red tobacco sale. He subtracted the fuel and the few inputs Earl had used. He looked at the number he had arrived at. "Earl," he said. "What?" "This is more than I made this year." Earl poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from him. "Well," he said, "I farmed 80 acres with inputs I borrowed against my next year's crop, and you farmed this on almost nothing and you came out ahead of me." "I've had longer to learn the land," Earl said. "That's not all it is." Earl was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It's not all it is. The bank situation resolved in December, not dramatically but adequately. Earl paid the interest on his existing debt with the tobacco money and had a conversation with a loan officer that went differently than any conversation he had ever had with the bank before, because for the first time in 4 years he sat down with numbers that were moving in the right direction. The officer, a younger man who had replaced the one Earl had dealt with before, looked at the figures Earl had brought and approved a modest operating loan for the following year. It was not a victory that would appear in a newspaper. But it was real. Gary Forsyth from the Extension Office came back in December as well, with a colleague from the University of Kentucky's Plant Science Department, a woman named Dr. Sandra Powell who studied genetic diversity in traditional crop varieties. She had been told about Earl's corn by Gary, who had thought about it all fall. They sat at Earl's kitchen table with the coffee tins open between them, the seed corn dried and clean and smelling faintly of the ash leaves he stored it with. Dr. Powell handled the seed with a care that Earl noticed and respected. She asked questions carefully and listened to the answers completely, which was not something Earl was accustomed to from institutional visitors. She told him what the seed was worth in terms he had not fully considered, not in dollars but in genetic terms, the decades of selection pressure represented in each kernel, the drought tolerance and the disease resistance and the specific adaptation to this particular valley and its particular soil and its particular pattern of late springs and dry Augusts. She told him that seed like this was disappearing from American farming faster than anyone had fully calculated, that the move to commercial hybrids had been good for average yields but had cost something that you could not buy back once it was gone. Earl listened. He looked at the tins. "What would the university want with it?" he said. "We'd want to preserve it," she said. "Document it. Study it. We'd want to understand what your family selected for and how." She paused. "We'd want to make sure it doesn't disappear." "I'm not disappearing," Earl said. She looked at him. "No," she said. "I can see that." They talked for 2 hours. The agreement they eventually reached was not complicated. Earl would share seed and documentation of his selection practices with the university's gene bank. The university would formally characterize and register the variety. Earl would retain complete ownership and the right to grow and sell the variety commercially. The university would acknowledge the Cutler family as the originators and stewards of the variety in any publication or registration. Lena sat through the meeting and said nothing until Dr. Powell had left. Then she sat at the kitchen table across from her father and looked at the coffee tins and looked at him. "Mama would have loved this," she said. Earl was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window the December fields were brown and still under a low gray sky. The creek was up from the last rain and you could hear it from the house, that low, constant sound that had been the background of every moment of Earl's life on this land. "She knew about the seed," he said. She understood it. She used to say that your great-great-grandfather didn't just bring corn from Virginia. He brought the knowledge of how to keep it going. He paused. She said that was the gift. The following spring, two things happened that Earl had not anticipated. The first was that Marcus Webb came to him in March and asked if he could learn the seed-saving practice. Not just for corn. For everything Earl was saving. He wanted to learn the whole of it, the selection criteria, the isolation methods, the storage, the records. He said he had been thinking about it all winter and he believed it was the most important agricultural knowledge in the county and he did not want it to exist in only one man's memory. Earl considered this for about 4 seconds. "Come on Saturday morning," he said. "Early." The second thing was that 3 other farmers from Harlan County contacted Earl in the spring of 1992, having heard through various channels about the Cutler's red tobacco sale and the corn yield and the university connection. They were not similar to each other. There was a younger woman who had inherited her parents' farm and was trying to keep it operating. There was an older man who had been farming conventionally for 40 years and was watching his input costs rise faster than his commodity prices and was looking for something different. There was a couple, husband and wife, who had been market gardening for 2 years and wanted to expand into grain. They all came to the farm on a Saturday in late March when the ground was just beginning to wake up. Earl walked them through the fields, still bare, and talked about the soil in a way that none of them had heard anyone talk about soil before, not as a medium for holding fertilizer but as a living system with its own logic and history, a system that rewarded patience and understanding and punished shortcuts, not always right away, but eventually and completely. He showed them the creek bank strip that had surprised him the previous spring. He explained how he had seen its potential, how the creek's shifting had created an opportunity he had not planned for but had been ready to recognize because he walked his ground every morning and paid attention. He said it the way you say something that seems obvious to you but that you have learned is not obvious to everyone. You have to know what you have before you know what to do with it, he said. He was looking at the dark soil along the creek bank, and then he looked up at the group standing around him. That's true for the land and it's true for everything else. He was talking about the seed tins. He was talking about the knowledge his family had kept. He was talking about the specific adaptation of his corn to his valley, the thing that the USDA men with their clipboards and their pamphlets about transitioning out of agricultural production had not known existed when they drove up his lane and posted their notice on his barn door. They had seen the debt. They had seen the drought years and the failed loans and the aging equipment and the old man on the wrong side of 60. They had seen what was visible. They had not gone into the cellar. By the summer of 1993, what Earl had started had a name, though Earl himself had not named it and was slightly embarrassed by the name when other people used it. The Harlan County Seed Collective was what Marcus Webb called it in a newsletter he had begun distributing to farm families across 3 counties. It was not a formal organization. There were no dues and no bylaws and no officers. It was, more precisely, a practice and a relationship, a group of farming families who had begun to share open-pollinated seed, to keep records, to make selection decisions carefully, and to meet at one farm or another in the late fall to talk about what the season had shown them. Earl came to these meetings and listened more than he talked, which was his way. He answered questions directly when asked and he did not soften his opinions to be agreeable, which the people who came to rely on him appreciated. He was not running anything. He did not want to run anything. What he was doing, and had always been doing, was farming. The farm itself had changed in ways that were visible to anyone who drove down the lane. The creek bank strip had become a permanent planting, rotating through beans and squash and a cover crop mix that Earl had developed over 2 seasons by observation and adjustment. The hillside pasture that Dale Pruitt had said you could sharpen a knife on had been seeded with a perennial grass mix that was slowly, season by season, building organic matter in the shallow soil. The main fields were deeper green in dry summers than the neighboring fields, and the neighborhood had begun to notice this, the way rural communities notice things without necessarily commenting on them directly. The John Deere 4020 had been rebuilt, properly, in the winter of 1992, with help from a retired mechanic named Walt Sizemore who lived in town and who came out on 3 successive Saturdays and worked alongside Earl in the cold barn until the engine ran the way it was supposed to run. It no longer burned oil. It started in cold weather. Earl kept it maintained with a regularity that would have impressed anyone who understood the relationship between an old farmer and an old tractor, which is not really about machinery at all. Lena had gone back to nursing part-time, 3 days a week at the clinic in Harlan, which gave her something outside the farm that she needed and gave Earl something too, a rhythm to the week and the knowledge that his daughter had her own life and was not simply staying out of obligation. They had not talked about this directly. They did not need to. In October of 1993, 2 years after the USDA men had driven down the lane with their clipboards and their pamphlets, Gary Forsyth from the Extension office came by again. He came in the evening this time, not officially, not with a notebook, just with himself. He and Earl sat on the porch in the cooling October air and watched the light go off the fields. The corn was already harvested. The bean vines were dry and brown on their poles. The curing barn had Cutler's red in it again, more of it this time, and the smell came out through the vent boards on the afternoon air. Gary had a cup of coffee. He did not say much for a while. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." "All right," Earl said. "When those USDA guys came in April of '91, what did you think when you walked back to the barn?" Earl thought about this. He looked at the fields going dark. "I thought about my grandfather," he said. "I thought about him loading that coffee tin of seed in Virginia. Not knowing exactly what he was going to. Knowing it might be hard." He paused. "I thought, he brought something that was worth bringing. And it was still here. And that was my job, really. To keep it here." "That's all you thought?" "I thought the ground was close to ready to plant," Earl said. "And that I had better figure out how to plant it." Gary laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that comes when something is funny and true at the same time. The fields held the last of the light for a few more minutes and then let it go. The creak sound came up in the quiet. Somewhere on the property, in the cellar under the house, the coffee tins sat on their shelves with their rust rings and their penciled labels, holding what 4 generations had chosen and kept and passed forward, waiting, as seed does, for the next spring. The ground was already resting toward it. And Earl Cutler, who had been written off in a government report and denied a loan and handed a pamphlet about transitioning out of the life his family had lived for nearly a century, sat on his porch in Harlan County, Kentucky, and was not finished, and had never been finished, and had known this all along in the way that people know things when they are rooted deep enough in a place and a practice that no document and no denial and no visiting man with clean boots and a clipboard can reach. The part of them that matters. The part that knows the ground. The part that saves the seed. The part that walks the fields before the sun is fully up and reads what is there and remembers what was there before and imagines what could be there if you are patient and careful and do not stop. That part had never been in any file they reviewed. It had never appeared on any debt-to-asset calculation. It had never been visible from a white government truck coming down a dirt lane in April. But it had been there. In the cellar. In the tins. In the dark, quiet soil of the bottom fields that the old maps had called generous. And it was there still. /parameter